Hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Lessons Learned from Rmat Submission, Denial, and Successful Resubmission. I'm Sharon Salt, Senior Editor of Regenerative, and I'll be your host for today's event. Before I introduce you to our speakers, I'd like to quickly cover a few housekeeping items. All the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right-hand corner. A copy of today's slide deck and our feedback survey are located in the resource list. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. Please let us know your thoughts on today's webinar by tweeting us at RegMedNet or by using the hashtag RMNWebinars, or simply share today's webinar with your friends and colleagues using the Share This widget on your screen. So some networks can cause slides to advance more slowly than others, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your slides are behind in any way, then pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. An on-demand version of today's webinar will also be available approximately 1 hour after the webinar and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. So, we are delighted to have both Stephen Westover and Brett Snyder from Cook MyoSite presenting for us today. Stephen is Director of Regulatory Affairs at Cook MyoSite, where he is the point of contact with health authorities for the clinical investigation and eventual commercial licensing of cellular therapy products. He also oversees the regulatory interactions and submissions to health authorities, including the US FDA, Health Canada, and European authorities. Brett started at Cook MyoSite in January 2010 in the QA department, moved into compliance, and finally into regulatory affairs. In her tenure at MyoSite, Brett has helped grow systems to fit CGMPs throughout the organization, helped regulatory move from paper submissions to electronic submissions, and is putting systems in place for the department to become an industry-leading group. So throughout this webinar, we'll invite the audience to submit any questions that you might have for our presenters using the Q&A widget to the right-hand side of your screen. We'll then pose your questions to Stephen and Brett in a live Q&A session after the presentation, and then follow up any outstanding questions offline. So thank you for joining us today, everyone. I'll now hand over to Stephen and Brett to start today's presentation.
Thank you, Sharon. Welcome, everyone. Brett and I are thankful for the opportunity to share our experiences at Cook MyoSite with the Rmat designation process. Cook MyoSite is located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and a division of Cook Medical. Cook MyoSite creates autologous cell therapy products with muscle progenitor cells. Currently, this technology is being investigated in clinical trials and is not commercially available. Cook MyoSite has a mission to make regenerative medicine a part of everyday medicine. We are excited to share this information so that everyone in the regenerative medicine community can learn from our experiences. Today we will cover the eligibility and benefits of Rmat, logistics and information to include in the IND submission, and status of our submissions that have been filed with the FDA. Then we'll discuss Cook MyoSite's product and clinical indication that has been submitted for designation and share experiences that we've had with this process. I'd like to turn it over at this time to Brett to start with the eligibility criteria.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to everyone listening. Some overall information. The Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy designation, referred to Rmat, was created with the passage of the 21st Century's Cure Act in 2016. Investigational products that are regulated according to Public Health Service Act 351 can apply for the designation, and they must meet the definition of a regenerative medicine. The definition is the medicines concerned with developing therapies that regenerate or replace injured, diseased, or defective cells, tissues, or organs that restore and establish function and structure. Investigational products intended to treat, modify, or reverse a serious condition and have preliminary clinical evidence to potentially address an unmet medical need. Products that are HCTPs regulated by Public Health Service Act 361 do not qualify for this designation. Also, just so you know, the Rmat designation and submission is an amendment to an IND or an IND that is requested for the original IND. So an active IND is intended or is needed for eligibility. A total of 165 applications for Rmat designations have been done over the years. 62 have been granted and 89 have been denied, which is about a 38% granted percentage. So you can see that the majority of designations are actually denied or withdrawn. But also, as of note, the first Rmat designated product was actually approved earlier this year. So a lot of companies are starting to see the benefits. Many Rmat designations or requests are denied due to placement against inactive INDs or submissions that are incomplete. Many are rejected due to CMC issues, meaning the product works for indication Y, so in theory it should work for indication Z, and the manufacturing may be a little bit different. The clinical data for Rmat submission also has not been directly related to the product of interest or a theoretical idea on how the investigational product works. Insufficient clinical evidence or data can also result in a request for reconsideration and may not always end up in a complete denial. Speaking of some benefits, if you are granted the Rmat designation, this designation combines the benefits of breakthrough designation and fast track for regenerative products. The benefits of Rmat include actions to expedite development and review, interactions to discuss potential or surrogate or intermediate endpoints, senior management involvement in meetings and reviews. Since Rmat is granted for serious conditions with unmet medical needs, then the product may also qualify for a priority review. This priority review should be discussed at the pre-BLA meeting prior to filing, and if that is granted, it reduces the timeline from 6 months down from 10 months to 6 months. We discussed eligibility and benefits, so let's move on to what information actually has to be in the submission. The guidance for expedited or regenerative medicine therapies for serious conditions spells out the terms of what needs to be submitted. The submission needs to include that the drug meets the regenerative medicine definition and how does it fall under Public Health Service Act 351 and the FD&C Act. What disease is the investigational drug potentially going to treat? Why is this a serious disease? And what publications can be used to say that there is a seriousness of the disease? Information included in the submission should be clinically focused and should clearly illustrate the connection between the unmet medical needs and the preliminary clinical evidence. The terms serious condition, unmet medical need, surrogate endpoint, intermediate clinical endpoint, and clinically significant endpoint have the same meanings as described in the Rmat guidance. Also of note, the FDA has 60 days to review and to make a determination. But note during the COVID-19 pandemic, they also may request additional time. Once you have the designation document written, the document should be submitted with a new IND or an amendment to an existing IND. Per the Rmat expedited guidance documents, the cover letter needs to detail what is in the submission, and you have to be specific with the subject, meaning it has to be in bold letters, request for regenerative medicine advanced therapy designation. We also communicated that the submission was going to be occurring to our RPM well advanced of the submission. While building the submission in our EC2D software, it did take us a minute to figure out where the Rmat submission should be placed, since it's not actually in the FDA EC2D headings and hierarchy document that we all use a lot for where things should be placed in the EC2D. There's one sentence dedicated in the placement of Rmat for Module 1 in the EC2D Conformance Guide, so it's placed in section 1.12.4. So how did our investigational product fit into the Rmat criteria and eligibility? Cook MyoSite opened an IND in 2008 to study AMDC, or autologous muscle-derived cells. AMDC is a personalized regenerative cell therapy investigational product. AMDC is created from muscle progenitor cells that are isolated from human adult muscles and are theorized to engraft into existing dysfunctional or weakened target tissue to improve muscle function. AMDC is being studied for multiple indications due to potentially helping weaken musculature around the body. The clinical indication furthest along in phase 3 studies is for stress urinary incontinence. The AMDC product is assigned a code based on this indication. For example, urinary sphincter repair or USR. So in our clinical documentation, our product is referred to as ANDC-USR. Studies for stress urinary incontinence have been performed in the US, Canada, and in Europe, and there's also plans underway to start a study in Japan. Over 500 patients have participated in the clinical studies for stress urinary incontinence. IED2 was our very first pivotal study and was completed in late 2019. So in our studies, data has been gathered on incontinence episode frequencies, or IEF, over a 3-day period. And our primary endpoint has evolved from study to study, and there's currently an endpoint set at a 75% reduction in IEF. With the clinical trials, we found that a certain subpopulation had met the Rmat criteria. And back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Brett. So as Brett mentioned, our current population was for stress urinary incontinence, and a population within the incontinence indication was identified as eligible for the Rmat designation. A stratified analysis of completed ongoing clinical studies has identified women with recurrent or persistent stress urinary incontinence symptoms following surgical treatment. Currently, there's a lack of non-surgical treatment options for women with SUI who failed prior SUI surgical treatment, and thus continue to live with unpredictable, life-altering urinary incontinence. MyoSite believes this indication, women with recurrent or persistent stress urinary incontinence symptoms after surgical treatment, is a serious condition resulting in chronic morbidity with an unmet medical need. And previous surgery may include surgical placement of synthetic mesh midurethral sling, or MUS, as it's often referred to. So for the timeline for our Rmat submission, the original submission was placed in July of 2019, and that submission included 35 clinical trial subjects. During review of that original submission, there were 2 requests for information that were made by the agency, and the review was prompt and timely. This was pre-COVID, and the decision was made within 50 days. The denial was due, though, to insufficient amount of preliminary clinical data that was submitted, so we received the denial letter in August of 2019. I'd like to take a moment and talk about the information requests that we received during that first submission. The 2 requests, one was for clarification of substantiating claims for safety over SUI interventions, and the other to provide more details on efficacy and safety data. So this first information request was more of a completeness check. The reviewer was making sure that anything stated in the application had data or a reference to substantiate the claim, and this was one area where we had to provide more information to substantiate that claim. The second information request was more focused on data analysis. We had provided the 12-month data, which is the data that is the primary endpoint, but the agency wanted to see data from other time points, and so we had to provide that additional data for the submission. But in the denial letter, the agency indicated that our product did meet several of the criteria or eligibility requirements for Rmat, in that it was met seriousness, unmet medical need, but the failure was around the amount of preliminary clinical data that was provided. But the denial letter did contain provisions to resubmit with additional data. It instructed us, it said, you may submit a new request for Rmat designation with new clinical evidence that indicates that the above described investigational product has the potential to address unmet medical needs and treatment of the clinical indication. And we were instructed to identify the request on the cover letter as a regenerative medicine advanced therapy reconsideration. So as Brett had mentioned earlier, when you do amend the IND to submit for the Rmat designation, there's a process for how you designate that request. And the agency provided instructions here for modification to that for the reconsideration so that we could supply additional data at a later point in time. So our RMAT reconsideration was submitted in September of 2020, and we had waited a little over a year to submit the reconsideration since more data was available. We now had a data set of 115 patients instead of 35. The additional data for reconsideration came from the IND2 trial that Brett had mentioned that had completed in late 2019. This resubmission included supporting efficacy tables and individual severe adverse event criteria and neoplasma listings based on what we learned from the original submission. So this time we were sure to include the data that we felt the agency would need for the review based on the requests that we received for information from the first round of RMAT review. And we did not have any information requests for the second reconsideration. The review did take much longer. The agency had asked for an additional 30 days due to constraint of resources of the FDA from COVID-19, but the designation was eventually granted in December of 2020 for this patient population. So once the RMAT designation is granted, there are next steps, and as an organization, we're currently working through those next steps. So here you can see clearly the agency requests that you submit a Type B meeting, and this is for an initial comprehensive multidisciplinary regenerative medicine advanced therapy meeting. And MyoSite has submitted a request for this meeting. We did that in March of this year, and we did just receive confirmation for this meeting, and it will be held on July 15th in 2021 for our initial comprehensive multidisciplinary meeting. And the meeting will cover several topics. CMC development, clinical, and non-clinical can all be included in the meeting. So for this meeting, this comprehensive multidisciplinary meeting, this slide has some resources that we've looked at that have helped us in planning for this meeting. In particular, this SOPP 8212, this is an FDA document, and it contains the procedure and process for conducting comprehensive multidisciplinary meetings. Now, this resource is for breakthrough designation instead of RMAT, but the same procedure can be followed. These comprehensive multidisciplinary meetings for breakthrough therapy, the ones for RMAT, follow the same procedure and guideline. And the procedure has a lot of detail. It calls for involvement of senior management at FDA. It establishes roles for the RPM at FDA in conducting the meeting with the sponsor. And so there's a lot of information for the comprehensive multidisciplinary meeting in this reference material. And in particular, Appendix A of the procedure is very useful and has a guideline of what should be covered and suggested topics for this multidisciplinary meeting. So I'll look at that next. So this is just a high-level listing of the topics. The Appendix A contains several subtopics. In the general section, there are recommendations for the target date for submitting your BLA. You can include information if you're planning to pursue a rolling review. You can spell out the specific indication for the approval. You can also indicate other indications that the product is being used for. There's topics of expanded access, accelerated approval, your plans for determining the proprietary name for the product. If there's any combination devices, those things can all be mentioned in the general section, and also a communication plan. So this is an opportunity to tell the FDA what future meetings or interactions you feel you need with them to finish the process of getting the product to market. In the clinical and statistical section, existing and planned clinical sites can be discussed. Preliminary evidence of efficacy, plans or completed clinical trials can be presented. Clinical trial safety monitoring plan, proposed size of safety population, risk evaluation mitigation can all be presented in the section for clinical and safety. In clinical pharmacology and pharmacokinetics, justification of dosing, specific populations, and immunogenicity can all be presented in that section. In the non-clinical pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, and toxicology section, the non-clinical studies with summary reports, timing of completion can all be presented in that information. And then in the chemistry, manufacturing, control section, there some suggested topics are drug product dosage, formulation, administration, critical quality attributes and stability, drug substance characterization with its critical quality attributes and stability, proposed commercial process, proposed validation approaches, and many more topics for CMC. So these are all suggested. When putting together our particular meeting package, we used Appendix A as a guideline, but then narrowed it down to where at this point in time we really would like to focus our conversations and discussions with the FDA in planning this comprehensive multidisciplinary meeting. So we're looking forward to having an in-depth discussion with FDA on the development of our products and present our clinical data and discuss those next steps to bring this product to these patients in need. So to summarize things up here and talk about the overall experience, it's important to ensure that the data supporting the RMAT indication directly relates to the product of interest. There's been a lot of, as Brett mentioned, a lot of those denials, some of it's insufficient clinical evidence, but a lot of it is because people will take a product and theorize that it'll work for an indication but not have evidence in that area. And the FDA really needs evidence with that product, with that particular indication. Denial doesn't mean the end. In this case, the FDA did give us an opportunity to provide additional data. So even though we received a denial letter, we were given instructions for how to provide additional data once it was available for reconsideration. And ensure you have sufficient clinical data for both safety and efficacy. Although it's preliminary data that is needed for assessment for an RMAT indication, the agency still, for that preliminary criteria, still needs significant evidence in the area of safety and efficacy when making this decision. So thank you for your time and interest in our experience of the RMAT designation process. At this time, Sharon will lead the question and answer session of the webinar.
Thank you very much for that very insightful presentation, Stephen and Brett. I hope our audience found it of great interest and value. So as Stephen said, if you do have any questions right now, then please do continue to submit them using the Q&A tool in the right-hand side of your screen. So we've received a number of questions so far, so I'll now address these live on air with Stephen and Brett. So our first question is, what does the RMAT designation do for expediting development for BLA approval?
Well, I think for
Go ahead, Stephen.
Sorry. I was going to say, I do feel like, there's a lot of opportunity, even in, once receiving the RMAT designation, the fact that you have that multidisciplinary comprehensive meeting with the FDA, there's just a lot of interaction with the agency on your development plans, where you're at as an organization with the product and the clinical indication. And so you do just get more opportunity for feedback from the FDA that helps you align your plans more quickly and efficiently. And there's also the involvement of senior management FDA, I feel helps as well. Oftentimes through the normal process, when working through the frontline staff, there can be times when those decisions made may conflict with the opinions of senior leadership at the FDA. So by pulling them in up front instead of on the back end through approval, it just helps that alignment and efficiency in the steps needed to move the product and the clinical indication.
Perfect. So our next question says, what are some of the biggest takeaways that you got from the first submission that made the second attempt a success?
I think with understanding what the FDA and the IRs that we received, additional clinical data was definitely needed and how to best present it. For instance, we had IRs that were related to and asking for individual safety listings. So we made sure that with the reconsideration, that we added that to the documentation so we wouldn't receive the same question, the same IR. So really understanding, you know, what was the FDA asking in terms of those IRs, and really then saying like, all right, how do we best make this meeting package as well defined for those characteristics that we know that they're looking for? What's the potential efficacy? What's the safety criteria that we see? What we already know that we had from the first submission that we had the understanding that it was an unmet serious medical need, which is really what we hit in the first one. So maybe we kind of pared that down and really hit hard the safety and eligibility and efficacy criteria for the second submission.
Perfect. So next up, our next question is, how did the FDA indicate that it was possible for you to resubmit after the initial denial? Is this always the case, or are there flat denials in some cases?
Yeah, I think, you know, for us, you know, again, the agency provided that option for reconsideration. So with, I mean, our clinical team could speak to it much better, but there is a placebo effect with stress urinary incontinence that has to be overcome in the trial design. And so, you know, the initial data set just wasn't quite enough and to really demonstrate significance. And so that's when we needed a larger data set to present to the agency for the decision. So I think in this case, the agency recognized that, like through the review, had come to a decision point where they couldn't make a conclusion, but they weren't, you know, absolutely giving us a denial as well. Through resources that we looked at, it does seem that there are often cases, you know, a flat denial where, you know, again, the person may be pursuing an indication for a product that hasn't quite been studied yet. You know, they're trying to relate it to an indication that's already approved for. And so since it's something related or kind of hypothetical, the evidence isn't there, and that's when the agency would give more of a flat denial and, you know, insist that they go explore that particular indication and then come back for Rmat at a later point in time.
Thank you. So next up we have, what is expected for preliminary clinical evidence, non-clinical studies, or results in a first-in-man?
Thank you for that. Yeah, this is, I think, is an interesting question because when you do look at the Rmat designation process, you can request an Rmat with a new IND. So obviously, with the new IND, you have no human data at that time point. It's all non-clinical, and so I think along the lines of any I guess application FDA, animal data does provide a supporting role in those decisions. And so, you know, if a sponsor did have a good animal model for a particular indication and had a significant amount of data in that animal model and could relate that to human experience, then, you know, non-clinical can play a much bigger part in the decision to grant an Rmat designation, you know, as provided for the option to ask for an Rmat with a new IND application. I do feel, at least from, you know, we did network with other companies and kind of ask about their experiences, and it does seem that, you know, from what I'm aware of, that option isn't used often. It really is after some clinical experience is gained, then the Rmat indication is pursued with that evidence.
I would also like to add that with our experience, we had our IND active for several years, so we actually didn't non-clinical data in the Rmat designation request. It was all based on preliminary clinical data. So we had a few phase 2 and a little bit of a phase 3 trial that kind of mixed in there too.
Perfect. Thank you. So the next question that's come up says, what would be your advice to be ready for an Rmat submission in terms of data on non-clinical studies, CMSN clinical data, etc.?
I think for being ready, one thing that's always, we stress the product relatedness part of it. When you look at the guidance document itself for RMAT, it has a focus on clinical data and preliminary clinical evidence. It's mentioned throughout the guidance document. And there's even, examples in the guidance for, various data sets that could be, provided for preliminary clinical evidence. But one thing in talking with, again, other companies and even just some presentations from FDA on this topic, it's really important that you relate the CMC, the product manufacturing, to the clinical indication. So in this case, we had experience or had data with our product with this particular clinical indication. We weren't trying to say that this product could work for this other indication but not have data. And so I think that's really important, where you really have to tie in your chemistry, manufacturing, control, that CMC section, your mechanism of action, and how that relates to the clinical data, so they can clearly see that this product, this clinical data was generated with that product of interest, because the indication is granted for the for the clinical indication, but it has to be related to the product.
And also to add, the risk and benefits have to be weighed out really well. So understanding the safety profile of your product is definitely necessary, and being able to show individualized listings and really show how it can be safe in humans, because that's ultimately what the FDA is really making sure, that everything is safe. And yes, it's preliminary clinically effective, but really weighing those risks and benefits, maybe compared to other products if you have that in your trial, but definitely having the risks spelled out in the safety criteria too.
Perfect. So thank you very much to both Stephen and Brett for answering our audience questions today. If our audience members do have any other questions for Stephen or Brett, then please feel free to send them into webinars@regmednet.com. So this should also appear on the screen for you. If you send any questions, we can also direct them to Stephen and Brett. I want to once again take this opportunity to thank our wonderful presenters, Stephen and Brett, as well as you, our listeners, for your time and questions today. So if you would like to let us know your thoughts on today's webinar, then please feel free to complete our feedback survey in the resource widget or tweet us at RegMedNet. For more webinars, please visit RegMedNet at www.regmednet.com/webinars. Thank you for attending today, everyone, and goodbye.